They traded her like cold currency in a rain-slicked alleyway, a daughter's life sacrificed to settle a gambler's debt. Amara Johnson had less than 24 hours left to live, handed over by her own mother to the city's most feared dragon, Kang Minyi. The paperwork was already filed. The life insurance policy was signed. To Denise Johnson, her daughter wasn't a person anymore. She was a final payout. The body wouldn't even need to be hidden. The ruthless Korean mafia didn't leave witnesses. But when Minyi stepped out of the shadows, his tailored black suit sharp against the neon gloom, something went off script. He reached out, his hand, marked by an intricate dragon tattoo that coiled up his neck, gripping Amara's chin. He expected to find a weeping girl begging for mercy. Instead, he saw the bruises her mother had left behind and a gaze filled with a fragile, haunting hope. In that moment, the monster did something that shocked everyone. He felt a protective rage. Denise Johnson thought she had just made the trade of a lifetime, but she had no idea she'd just handed her daughter the keys to her own destruction. Welcome to Korean Mafia Love Tales, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling mafia tales filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story of bloody debt is paid, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you'd never forgive your family for? The air inside the Sapphire Lounge was a stagnant soup of expensive cigars, stale sweat, and the electric hum of desperation. Denise Johnson stared at the cards in her hand, her vision blurring at the edges as the overhead lights caught the glint of the diamond ring she had pawned and replaced with glass fakes months ago. Across the green baize table, the dealer's face was a mask of professional indifference. "The bet is to you, Mrs. Johnson," he murmured. Denise's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm. She looked at the stack of chips in front of her, the last of the emergency fund she'd stolen from Amara's college savings. If she won this hand, she could pay off the mortgage, fix the car, and maybe, just maybe, look her daughter in the eye again. She pushed the entire stack into the center. All in. The reveal was a slow-motion car crash. When the dealer flipped the final card, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Denise didn't have the winning hand. She didn't even have the second best. She had nothing. The silence that followed was broken by a heavy, measured footfall. A man in a charcoal suit, his presence as cold as an ice floe, stepped out from the VIP shadows. This was Minyi's lead enforcer, a man known only as Jun. He didn't look at the cards. He looked at Denise, his eyes narrowed and predatory. "That wasn't just money, Denise," Jun said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. "That was the final extension. The boss doesn't like being kept waiting." I can get it," Denise stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Just one more week, I have a plan." "The plan is over," Jun replied, sliding a single, thick sheet of parchment across the table. It wasn't a standard bank document. At the top, a stylized dragon, the mark of Kang Minyi, seemed to writhe in the dim light. "Your debts have reached a ceiling, but the boss is willing to make a trade. One life for another." Denise looked at the contract. Her eyes skipped over the legal jargon and landed on the blank line at the bottom, then shifted to the name typed into the collateral clause, Amara Johnson. A wave of nausea hit her, but right behind it was a chilling, narcissistic clarity. She thought of the life insurance policy she'd quietly taken out on Amara a year ago. If she signed this, the debt vanished. If the mafia disposed of the girl, the payout would make Denise a wealthy woman. Her hand shook as she reached for the gold-plated pen Jun offered. She didn't think of Amara's smile or the way her daughter had worked 2 jobs to help with the bills. She thought of the neon lights and the next hand of cards. With a sharp, jagged motion, Denise signed her daughter's life away. "Excellent," Jun whispered, retrieving the paper. "We'll collect the payment tonight." Denise didn't watch him leave. She was already looking at the empty seat across from her, wondering how long it would take for the insurance check to clear. The engine of the black sedan hummed with a predatory low-frequency vibration that seemed to settle in Amara's very bones. Outside the tinted glass, the world was a smear of neon signs and rain-slicked pavement, a city that looked like it was mourning a death she hadn't quite died yet. Her wrists were bound, the plastic zip ties biting into her skin with every jolt of the car, but the physical sting was nothing compared to the hollow coldness in her chest. Denise hadn't even looked at her when the men arrived. Her mother had simply stood in the doorway of their cramped apartment, clutching a glass of cheap amber liquid, her eyes already distant, calculating a future that didn't include a daughter. "Don't make a scene, Amara," Denise had whispered, her voice devoid of everything but a tired sort of greed. "It's better this way, for everyone." The enforcer beside Amara, a wall of silent muscle, didn't offer a word of comfort or a threat. His silence was far worse. It treated her like cargo, a shipment of fine china that merely needed to arrive unbroken. Amara closed her eyes, trying to find a memory of a time when she was more than a bargaining chip, but the memories were as thin as the zip ties around her wrists. She was 24 years old, and she had been sold like an antique to settle a debt she never spent a dime of. The sedan eventually slowed, the tires crunching over gravel as they passed through a set of iron gates that looked like the teeth of a great beast. This was the fortress of Kang Minyi. It was a monolith of glass and dark stone, standing apart from the city's grime, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying power. To the world, it was a palace of industry. To Amara, it was the place where her story would likely end. As the car came to a halt, the door was pulled open from the outside. The air that rushed in was crisp and smelled of expensive cedar and rain. Amara was guided out, her legs trembling so violently she nearly stumbled. The enforcer caught her arm, his grip firm and impersonal, as he led her toward the massive double doors. Inside, the foyer was a cathedral of marble and shadow. Every footfall echoed like a heartbeat. Amara stared at her feet, her natural textured hair falling in messy strands over her glossy, tear-streaked eyes. She expected a dungeon, or perhaps a room filled with the kind of men who inhabited her mother's gambling dens. She expected to be broken. She didn't realize that in this house of shadows, the monster was already waiting, watching from the top of the stairs with a narrowed, calculating gaze that was about to find something in her that no one else ever had. The heavy oak doors creaked shut, leaving Amara alone in a study that breathed of old paper and lethal intent. She stood in the center of the room, her shoulders hunched, every instinct screaming at her to vanish into the shadows. The silence was absolute until a side door opened, and the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Kang Minyi walked in with the silent, fluid grace of an apex predator. He didn't look like the street thugs her mother usually owed. He was dressed in a black tailored suit that fit his lean, powerful frame with clinical precision. As he moved closer, the dim light caught the edge of a dark, intricate tattoo coiling up his neck like a dragon's tail, disappearing beneath a jawline carved from granite. He stopped just a foot away. Amara didn't look up, her glossy, wide eyes fixed on his polished shoes. She felt his gaze, intense, calculating, and heavy. He was looking for a payout, for a piece of property he could use to balance a ledger. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in her chest. Amara slowly lifted her head. A stray strand of her natural hair fell across her face, partially obscuring the yellowing bruise near her temple, the mark Denise had left when Amara had initially refused to get into the car. She saw his eyes narrow, not with the anger of a creditor, but with a sudden, piercing focus. He wasn't looking at her as a debt. He was looking at her as if he were seeing the ghost of a person. Then the monster did something that shattered her expectations. He reached out, his movements slow and controlled. Amara flinched, bracing for a blow, but instead, she felt the warmth of his fingers beneath her chin. His grip was steady but surprisingly gentle, lifting her face so the light hit the damage Denise had tried to hide. His eyes scanned her tear-streaked cheeks and the glossy confusion in her gaze, settling on the fragile hope she couldn't quite extinguish. The silence stretched, charged with a new, dangerous electricity. "Your mother told me she was handing over a worthless asset," Minyi murmured, his thumb brushing just below the bruise with a touch so light it was almost a caress. "She lied. She didn't send me a debt. She sent me a survivor." He let go of her chin, but he didn't step back. The calculating coldness in his expression had shifted into a dark, protective intensity. "You can stop shaking, Amara. In this house, you are no longer currency. You are no longer a debt to be settled. From this moment, you are under the protection of the dragon." Amara's breath hitched, a single sob breaking through her resignation. For the first time in her life, the most dangerous man in the city had offered her the one thing her own blood had denied her: a sanctuary. The days that followed were a surreal blur of velvet and silence. Amara was led to a suite on the third floor of the fortress, a room larger than the entire apartment she had shared with Denise. The floors were covered in thick, cream-colored silk rugs that swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of expensive jasmine and rain. On the bed lay a collection of clothes that looked like they belonged to a princess: cashmere sweaters, silk robes, and tailored dresses in soft, neutral tones. For the first time in her life, Amara didn't have to worry about where her next meal was coming from or if the electricity would be cut off by noon. A silent maid brought trays of steaming food, delicate Korean delicacies and hearty comforts, but Amara barely tasted them. To her, the luxury felt like a gilded cage. She spent hours staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, waiting for the moment the protection would turn into a demand, or for the dragon to decide his patience had run out. Every time a floorboard creaked or a shadow moved in the hallway, she tensed, bracing for the inevitable. She was a guest in name, but she still felt like collateral. That changed on a Tuesday evening when Minyi requested her presence in his private library. She expected a lecture on her duties, or perhaps a final bill for her mother's sins. Instead, she found him sitting by a roaring fireplace, surrounded by towering walls of leather-bound books. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the rest of the dark dragon ink that snaked down his forearm. He didn't loom over her this time. He gestured to the velvet armchair across from him. "Sit, Amara." When she hesitated, he didn't snap. He simply waited, his calculating gaze softening into something like respect. "You look for the bars on the windows, but they aren't there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I didn't bring you here to be a ghost in my halls. I brought you here because you have eyes that see the truth of this city." He slid a tablet across the mahogany table. It contained a complex map of local business interests, some of which belonged to the very people Denise had gambled with. "My advisors think this is a simple acquisition," he murmured, looking her directly in the eye, treating her like a peer for the first time. "I want to know what someone who has lived in those shadows thinks." As Amara leaned forward, her fragile hope began to solidify into something sharper. He wasn't just feeding her or clothing her, he was asking for her mind. The gilded cage didn't disappear, but for the first time, Amara realized the door wasn't locked from the outside. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was being invited to become an architect of her own fate. The transition from a prison to a sanctuary was jarring, but it was the silence of Minyi's fortress that felt the loudest. For the next 3 days, Amara lived in a world of soft linens and quiet corridors, her physical wounds beginning to fade even as the psychological ones deepened. She spent hours by the window, watching the city breathe from a distance, wondering when the other shoe would drop. The summons to Minyi's private office came on the 4th evening. He was sitting behind a desk of polished obsidian, the blue glow of several monitors reflecting in his dark, unreadable eyes. Standing beside him was Jun, the enforcer who had first collected her, holding a slim tablet like a weapon. "Sit," Minyi said, his voice a low vibration that commanded the room. Amara took the seat across from him, her heart doing a frantic dance against her ribs. "My team has been digging into the transaction that brought you here," Minyi began, his hands folding neatly on the desk. "I don't like being a pawn in someone else's game, Amara. And your mother was playing a very specific game." He nodded to Jun, who slid the tablet across the desk toward her. Amara's hands trembled as she looked at the screen. It wasn't a gambling contract. It was a digital copy of a high-value life insurance policy taken out in her name just 6 months prior. "She didn't just sell you to settle a debt," Minyi said, his tone dropping into a cold, dangerous register. "She specifically sought out my organization. She knew my reputation. She knew that people delivered to me for payment usually don't come back." Amara stared at the highlighted clause, accidental death or disappearance. The payout was staggering, $5 million, enough to settle every debt Denise had and leave her a queen for the rest of her life. The realization hit Amara with the force of a physical blow. Her mother hadn't been desperate or backed into a corner. She had been strategic. She hadn't just sold Amara into slavery, she had sent her to her execution. Denise didn't want the debt cleared. She wanted the insurance check that could only be cashed once Amara was a corpse. "She wanted me dead," Amara whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "She didn't just leave me, she signed for my death." Minyi watched her, his sharp jawline tightening. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to shift as his gaze darkened with a simmering, protective fury. "She made a miscalculation," he said, standing up and moving around the desk. He stopped beside her chair, his presence a towering shield of shadow. "She assumed I was a mindless butcher who would do her dirty work for free. She didn't realize that in her greed, she handed me the only thing she ever truly had power over." He looked down at her, his eyes narrowed and intense. "The debt is no longer yours, Amara. It's hers. And I think it's time we start the harvest." While Amara began to heal within the quiet sanctuary of the fortress, the world outside was beginning to collapse for Denise Johnson. She sat in her living room, a half-empty glass of amber liquid sweating against the coaster, waiting for the phone call that would confirm the unfortunate accident and trigger the insurance payout. She had already spent hours browsing luxury real estate in the Maldives, imagining a life where the smell of stale casinos and cheap apartments was nothing but a bad memory. The first crack in her new fantasy appeared at 9:00 a.m. A notification chimed on her phone, a brief clinical message from her bank stating that her primary savings account had been frozen due to irregularities. Denise scoffed, assuming it was a clerical error, but when she tried to log in, the screen flashed a stark, blood-red denial. Access revoked. An hour later, a heavy knock thundered against her front door. It wasn't the insurance agent she expected. Instead, 2 men in identical charcoal suits stood on her porch, their faces as expressionless as tombstone granite. They didn't say a word as they handed her a stack of legal documents. Within minutes, Denise realized the nightmare was expanding. Her car was being repossessed, and a foreclosure notice had been filed against her apartment, not by a bank, but by a holding company she had never heard of, Dragon's Reach. Panic flared in her chest, hot and suffocating. She reached for her phone to call the underground contacts she'd cultivated over years of gambling, the men who usually fixed her problems for a price. One by one, the calls went to a dead tone. It was as if she had become a ghost in her own city, her social and financial existence being systematically erased by an invisible hand. She didn't know that miles away, in a room filled with the soft hum of cooling servers and the glow of high-resolution monitors, Minyi was watching the harvest unfold. He sat beside Amara, showing her the data as Denise's life was dismantled digit by digit. To Minyi, this was a surgical procedure, the removal of a parasite. To Amara, it was a terrifyingly beautiful realization. The mother who had sold her was finally finding out that some debts are paid in more than just money. By sunset, Denise was sitting in the dark, her electricity cut off, the silence of the apartment feeling like a physical weight. She clutched the gold-plated pen she had used to sign the contract, her mind racing. She still believed she was the player, the one in control. She had no idea that the ghost striking at her life was the very dragon she had tried to feed her daughter to, and the final bill was about to be hand-delivered. Denise Johnson smoothed the silk of her newly purchased dress, a deep emerald green that cost more than Amara's old car. In her mind, the transition was already complete. The accident had surely happened by now, The life insurance company had already acknowledged her preliminary claim, and all that remained was the final sign-off from the man who had facilitated her fortune. She stepped out of the elevator into the penthouse of the obsidian tower, her heels clicking a rhythm of triumph against the polished slate floors. The room was vast, floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of the city Denise felt she finally owned. Rain lashed against the panes, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive sandalwood. In the center of the room, seated behind a monolithic desk of black steel, was Kang Minyi. He was framed by the storm, his silhouette sharp and imposing. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. "You are punctual. I assume you are here for the final settlement." Denise flashed a practiced, grieving smile, though her eyes remained hard and bright with greed. "It's been a difficult few weeks, Mr. Kang. The loss of my daughter. Well, one must find a way to move forward. I believe our contract is fulfilled." Minyi didn't move. He sat with his hands steepled, the dark ink of the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing to pulse in the dim light. "Fulfilled? That is an interesting word. You delivered a life to settle a debt. You expected that life to be extinguished so you could profit from the ashes. A double transaction, very efficient." Denise's smile faltered slightly. The tone of his voice wasn't celebratory, it was judicial. "I don't follow, Mr. Kang. I did what I had to do." "I know exactly what you did," Minyi murmured, standing up slowly. He walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory. "But there is a flaw in your math, Denise. You calculated the value of your daughter's life based on a policy." "I calculated her value based on her spirit." He stopped a few feet from her, his narrowed gaze pinning her in place. "The final payment isn't going to you. In my world, we don't reward those who trade their own blood for a seat at a table they didn't earn." Denise's heart began to hammer, a familiar, frantic panic rising in her throat. "What are you talking about? We had a deal." "The deal changed the moment I touched her face and realized she was worth 1,000 of you," Minyi said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. He turned slightly toward the shadowed corner of the room. "The final transaction is hers to collect, not yours." From the darkness, a figure stepped into the light. Amara stood there, no longer disheveled or bruised. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray, her hair styled with a sharp, sovereign elegance. Her eyes, once glossy with fear, were now cold and focused. Denise's breath hitched, her face turning a sickly shade of ash as she realized the dragon hadn't been her executioner. He had been her daughter's architect. The grand ballroom of the Intercontinental was a sea of shimmering silk and forced laughter, the kind of place where Denise Johnson finally felt she belonged. She swirled a glass of vintage champagne, her eyes scanning the room with the predatory hunger of a woman who had successfully traded her soul for a seat at the high table. To the elite surrounding her, she was a grieving mother whose daughter had tragically vanished. To herself, she was a genius who had turned a blood debt into a lifestyle. But the atmosphere shifted with the suddenness of a blade's edge. The heavy gilded doors swung open, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Kang Minyi entered first, his presence commanding the very air. He looked every bit the dragon, his charcoal suit absorbing the light of the chandeliers. But it was the woman on his arm who caused the glass in Denise's hand to tremble. Amara walked with a grace that was no longer fragile. She was draped in midnight blue silk that contrasted perfectly with her natural glow, her head held high, her gaze narrowed and steady. The package Denise had sold to be destroyed had returned as a sovereign. Denise's face drained of color, the champagne spilling over her knuckles as Amara stepped out from Minyi's shadow. The crowd parted like a receding tide, leaving mother and daughter in a vacuum of frozen time. "Amara," Denise gasped, her voice cracking through her polished facade. You're alive, thank God, I thought." "You thought the insurance check would clear by now," Amara interrupted. Her voice wasn't a scream. It was a calm, lethal whisper that carried further than a shout. "You thought that by handing me to the dragon, you were signing my death warrant. But all you did was show him exactly what kind of monster you really are." Denise tried to reach out, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a lie to hide behind. Sweetie, you don't understand. I did it to save us. I was in over my head. You did it to save yourself, Amara said, taking a final, decisive step forward. She was no longer the girl with tear-streaked cheeks and bruised hope. She was the woman who had seen the bottom of the abyss and climbed out. The debt is settled, Denise, but not with my life. It's settled with yours. Minyi stepped up behind Amara, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder, his eyes fixed on Denise with a chilling, detached promise of ruin. In that moment, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it shattered. Denise looked at her daughter and realized she wasn't looking at a victim. She was looking at the new law of the city. As the first pair of handcuffs clicked shut behind Denise's back, Amara didn't look away. She simply watched as the woman who sold her was finally led into the cold, leaving Amara standing in the light, finally, irrevocably sovereign. The downfall of Denise Johnson was not a spectacular explosion, but a cold, rhythmic dismantling that left her shivering in the very gutters she had feared. By the time the final gavel fell on her fraud charges, she had already been bled dry. The insurance companies had clawed back every cent, her creditors had stripped the walls of her apartment bare, and the gambling dens that once felt like home now barred their doors at the mere sight of her. She was a woman who had traded her soul for a winning hand, only to find the deck had been stacked against her from the start. High above the city's grinding gears, the air was different, thin, quiet, and smelling of rain and expensive cedar. Amara stood on the sprawling terrace of the Dragon's Fortress, her hands resting on the cold glass railing. She was no longer the disheveled girl in the neutral-toned rags, the one whose chin was lifted in a dimly lit room of judgment. She wore silk now, a deep charcoal that mirrored the midnight sky, and her gaze was no longer glossy with tears. It was narrowed, sharp, and settled with the heavy weight of authority. A shadow moved behind her, fluid and silent. Minyi stepped into the light of the moon, the dragon tattoo on his neck appearing almost restless in the flickering city glow. He didn't stand over her like a master. He stood beside her as an equal. The power dynamic that had begun with a transaction had evolved into something far more dangerous to their enemies, a partnership. The last of the Johnson debts have been erased, Minyi murmured, his voice a low vibration that no longer inspired fear, but a strange, grounded peace. She's gone, Amara. There is nothing left of that life. Amara turned her head slightly, her profile silhouetted against the sea of neon lights below. She thought of the blood payment and the mother who had seen her as a payday. That girl was dead, but the woman who replaced her was something Denise could never have imagined. It wasn't just about the debt, Minyi, Amara replied, her voice steady and resonant. It was about the sovereign. She tried to sell my future, but she only succeeded in handing me yours. Minyi reached out, his hand finding hers on the railing. His grip was the same as it was that first night, controlled, surprisingly gentle and unbreakable. Together, they looked out over the sprawling urban labyrinth. The city didn't know it yet, but the hierarchy had shifted. The Queen of Shadows and the Dragon were no longer figures of a tragic transaction. They were the architects of a new reign, ruling side by side from the fortress where a monster had once chosen to be a man, and a victim had chosen to be a queen. Here comes the end of the story. If the story hit you, click a like button, subscribe to our YouTube channel and drop the comment below.